America poured billions into beating the fastest fighter jet on Earth. And when they finally cracked one open, they found kitchen metal, stainless steel, welded by hand, uneven, heavy as a truck. That was the plane that terrified the Pentagon for almost a decade, the MiG-25. The Soviets called it the Foxbat, and for years the smartest military minds in the West lost sleep over it. They were scared of the wrong thing. Completely wrong. This is the story of how a rumor, a defector, and a runway that was too short exposed the biggest bluff of the Cold War. Rewind to the late 1950s. Soviet engineers sit down with one job: stop the Americans. Fast planes like the SR-71 Blackbird are slicing across Soviet skies at speeds no fighter can touch, and the men in Moscow have no answer. So they start sketching an aircraft called the YE-155. It would grow into the MiG-25. The goal was simple and desperate. Build something that climbs high enough and flies fast enough to catch anything the enemy sends. On March 6, 1964, the first prototype leaves the ground. It works. And that flight set off a chain of fear that would ripple across 2 continents. The panic began in July 1967. The Soviet Union rolls prototype interceptors out at a Moscow air show in front of the whole world. Western analysts stare at those enormous wings and that brutal frame, and they make a guess that would cost a fortune. They decide this thing is an agile dogfighter, a monster that can turn and twist and outfly anything America has. They saw big wings and assumed speed plus agility. Nobody had actually flown against it. Nobody had touched it. They just looked, and they imagined the worst. So how does one airshow photo spiral into a national security emergency? That's the pattern this channel lives for. Subscribe, and you'll start seeing how often fear, not facts, drives the biggest decisions in history. Because what happened next in America was built entirely on a mistake. The Americans reacted the only way they knew how. They built bigger. The fear of the MiG-25 pushed engineers to make their new fighter, the F-15, larger and more powerful than first planned. Let me be clear about something, because people get this wrong all the time. The US did not copy the MiG-25 to build the F-15. That design was already moving. But the terror of a Soviet super dogfighter forced them to supersize it. More thrust, more muscle. A plane built to beat a threat that, as it turns out, did not exist the way they thought. All that money, all that engineering, chasing a ghost. In 1970, the MiG-25 officially enters service with the Soviet Air Force. On paper, it looked unstoppable. Fast, high-flying, armed. The West still had no idea what was really inside it. And the Soviets were happy to let the mystery grow, because fear was doing their work for them. Why spend money proving your enemy wrong when their own imagination builds you a legend for free? Classic. Every silent year that passed, the myth got bigger. The Foxbat became the boogeyman of Western air forces, a jet nobody understood, hiding behind the Iron Curtain. Then came the moment that should have blown the whole thing open. November 6, 1971. A Soviet MiG-25 streaks over the Sinai Peninsula, held by Israel at the time. Israeli jets scramble to intercept. The Foxbat pushes its throttle and hits Mach 3.2.2 times the speed of sound. It escapes. Clean getaway. But there was a price, and it was ugly. That speed melted the engines, ruined them. The plane got away, and its heart burned out doing it. That single flight told the truth to anyone paying attention. This jet could not fly that fast and survive. The engines cooked themselves, so the Soviets set a hard rule for their pilots. Mach 2.83. That was the ceiling. Go past it, and you risk turning your turbines into slag in the sky. So the plane that America feared as an untouchable Mach 3 killer? It was actually a plane its own pilots were told to hold back. The legend and the machine were 2 different things. One lived in Western nightmares. The other lived under strict speed limits, held together with steel. And speaking of that steel, 80% of the MiG-25 was made of stainless steel. Not the exotic titanium everyone assumed. Stainless steel. The kind of metal you'd find in a heavy industrial kitchen. Why? Because the Soviets could not weld titanium easily in mass production. They didn't have the tools for it, so they used what worked. Heavy, tough, weldable steel, put together by hand. It made the plane a beast to lift, but it survived the heat of high-speed flight. Simple, crude, effective. That's a theme with this aircraft you'll see again and again. There was another thing the West got completely backwards: the electronics. When people first learned the MiG-25 used old vacuum tubes instead of modern transistors, they laughed. Backwards Soviets, stuck in the past. Wrong again. Those vacuum tubes were a choice. They were cheap. They shrugged off the intense heat of Mach-level flight. And they could survive the electromagnetic pulse of a nuclear blast. In a war the Soviets were planning for, transistors might fry. Tubes would keep working. That's not backwards. That's ruthless practicality. If this is landing for you, take 1 second to hit the like button. It genuinely pushes this story to more people who grew up hearing the myth and never got the truth. Then there was the radar. 600 kilowatts of raw power. It was strong enough to punch straight through Western radio jamming, which was the whole point. But that kind of energy came with a dark side. Fire that radar up on the ground, and it could kill small animals standing nearby. A radar so powerful it was dangerous to be near. The Soviets weren't building something elegant. They were building something that overpowered every problem with brute force. And it worked. But brute force has a weakness, exposed by one specific pilot. September 6, 1976. This is the day everything unravels. A young Soviet pilot named Viktor Belenko takes off on what's supposed to be a routine training flight. But Belenko had other plans. He breaks away from the group. He drops the plane low, hugging the ground to slip under radar coverage, and he points his MiG-25 toward Japan. He's defecting. He's handing the West its greatest prize. And he's flying the most secret jet in the Soviet arsenal straight into enemy hands. But nothing goes smoothly. Low on fuel, Belenko is forced to land at a civilian airport in Hakodate, where the runway is far too short for his heavy machine. The jet touches down, screams down the tarmac, and can't stop in time. It plows off the end and into the dirt. Belenko climbs out into a crowd of stunned Japanese civilians and does something desperate. He fires his gun into the air, not to hurt anyone, to warn them back, to keep people away from the aircraft. Then he asks for asylum. One man, one plane. And the entire mystery of the Foxbat cracked wide open on a foreign runway. Picture the scene in Washington when the news landed. The jet they'd feared for 9 years. The ghost that shaped billion-dollar programs. Sitting in the dirt in Japan, available for inspection. U.S. intelligence pounced. They pulled the plane apart, piece by piece. And they spent 5 months interviewing Belenko, squeezing every secret out of him about Soviet tactics, training, and technology. 5 months. Think about how much they didn't know, that it took that long to learn it all. The plane falling into their hands caused the whole illusion to collapse at once. What the U.S. engineers found stunned them. There was no titanium miracle. The welds were rough and uneven, many finished by hand alongside automatic machine welds. The wings were heavy steel. The design was simple, almost crude by Western standards, and yet it flew. It did its job. The men who tore it apart expected a technological marvel and found a workhorse built from common materials and blunt engineering. That was the real shock. The Foxbat was surprisingly ordinary. And ordinary had held the most powerful military on Earth in a state of fear for the better part of a decade. For Soviet military leadership, this was a catastrophe. By November 1976, just 2 months after Belenko landed, the Soviets went into panic mode. They assumed the Americans now knew every single secret, which they mostly did. So they scrambled to upgrade the entire fleet. New radars, new engines, a rush job to make the compromised jet relevant again. One unhappy pilot, one short runway, and the Soviet Union had to reinvent its prized interceptor on the fly. That's the cost of building your power on a bluff. When the bluff gets called, everything comes crashing down at once. But here's what I love about this machine, and it's the part the fearmongers always missed. The MiG-25 could actually do impressive things. On August 31st, 1977, Soviet test pilot Alexander Fedotov took a modified version and flew it up into the edge of the atmosphere. He reached 37,650 meters, an altitude record for this type of aircraft that still stands today. Nearly 50 years later, nothing of its kind has climbed higher. The plane was simply misunderstood. Built for a narrow job and shockingly good at it. That's the lesson buried in all this steel. The MiG-25 was never the agile dogfighter the West imagined. It couldn't twist and turn with nimble fighters. It was a straight-line speedster, a high-altitude interceptor, a tool built for one purpose. The tragedy and the comedy is that the fear it created was based on a fantasy. America built a more capable fighter to beat a threat that fought nothing like they expected. Millions spent chasing an imaginary opponent. And the real plane, The steel one just kept doing its simple job year after year. Production of the MiG-25 finally ended in 1984 after 20 straight years of building them. When the counting stopped, 1,186 of these jets had rolled out of Soviet factories. More than 1,000 steel beasts, each one a monument to a philosophy the West never understood. Don't build the perfect plane. Build the plane you can actually make, with the tools you actually have, that survives the war you're actually planning for. Crude? Sure. But it filled the skies for 2 decades, and it did exactly what it was designed to do. And the story doesn't end with the Soviet Union. This machine outlived the empire that built it. The pilot who gave it all away, Viktor Belenko, spent his later years in America, the country he'd risked everything to reach. He died on September 24, 2023, in a nursing home in Illinois at the age of 76. The man who ended the biggest military scare of the Cold War, passing quietly, decades after his 15 minutes shook 2 superpowers. One flight, one decision. It rewrote what the West knew about its greatest fear. Then, in mid-2022, the very last chapter closed. The Algerian Air Force, the final military on Earth still flying the MiG-25, retired it for good. They sent it up one final time during a parade, a farewell flight for a legend that had haunted the skies since entering service in 1970. 60 years after that first prototype lifted off, the steel jet made its last takeoff when its final active operator retired the aircraft. Gone. And with it, the last living piece of a myth that terrified the most powerful nation on the planet. So what's the truth about the stainless steel jet the US feared most? It was never the monster they imagined. It was heavy, hand-welded, with electronics powered by old tubes and held back by its own speed limit, and it still ranked among the most feared aircraft ever built, purely because nobody on the other side knew what was inside it. Fear filled in the blanks. Fear built the F-15 bigger. Fear cost fortunes. And it took one defector and a runway that was too short to prove the whole thing was smoke. If this story got under your skin, if you love the moment the legend meets the truth, like this video and subscribe. There are so many more myths waiting to be torn apart, one rivet at a time.